I always thought there's something magical about roads that lead to old houses. The kind that stretch long and narrow, lined with trees, their branches leaning over like they're whispering secrets to anyone passing by. That's exactly the road I found myself on, walking toward the forgotten Ash Grove mansion. The sun had begun its slow descent, painting the sky with a soft wash of orange and pink that faded into purple. Even the wind seemed calmer than usual, brushing softly against my cheeks, as if encouraging me to take my time. The house was still hidden behind the tall trees, but I could feel its presence. Not scary, not loud, just quietly waiting, patient, like it had all the time in the world. The road beneath my feet was scattered with fallen leaves, crunching softly with every step, like tiny whispers announcing my arrival. It wasn't eerie, it was oddly comforting. As I turned the last bend, I finally saw the mansion in its entirety. Time had left its mark. The stone walls were weathered, windows slightly clouded with dust, and ivy curled lazily up the sides. It looked tired, yes, but also dignified, like an old storyteller who had lived through centuries and had countless tales to tell. And in its silence, it commanded attention. I paused at the edge of the yard just to take it all in. The air carried a mixture of damp earth, moss, and something faintly sweet, like old books or forgotten letters. Cozy, somehow. If scents had awards, this one would have definitely won Most Nostalgic. I stepped closer to the wrought iron gate that guarded the mansion. It squeaked as I pushed it open, a slow, drawn-out sound that could have been mistaken for a yawn. Not the kind that made your hair stand on end, but the kind that said, "Ah, someone's finally here. Good." The yard stretched before me, untamed yet beautiful, with patches of wildflowers bravely poking through the grass. Nature clearly had its own plans and didn't care much about old blueprints or garden designs. The mansion's front door was massive, made of heavy oak, carved with intricate patterns that had faded into gentle grooves over time. I reached out and ran my fingers along the wood. Cool, solid, full of stories. Stories that probably wouldn't shout at you, but would whisper if you listened closely. I hesitated for a heartbeat, then pushed it gently. The door groaned in protest, swinging open just enough to invite me inside. The entrance hall smelled like the perfect combination of old wood, faint candle wax, and a hint of something floral. Maybe someone once kept dried flowers here. It was comforting. I stepped in, and the door clicked softly behind me, echoing just enough to let me know the house had acknowledged my presence. Not in a scary way, more like it was nodding politely. The entrance hall was vast, with a high ceiling that made me tilt my head back in awe. Dust danced in the fading light, floating lazily like tiny stars. A grand staircase rose ahead of me, banisters carved with patterns that spoke of patient craftsmen and long hours of dedication. A chandelier hung above, dusty but still regal, as if it had seen generations pass beneath it and had quietly judged every one. The walls were lined with faded wallpaper and wooden panels, each telling its own story in silence. I ran my hand along a panel, feeling the grooves and tiny imperfections. This house was patient, steady, almost meditative. It had waited through centuries, through storms, through families coming and going, and yet it still stood, quietly observing. I moved deeper into the hall, my footsteps creaking on the old wooden floor. Each sound seemed amplified by the stillness, and yet, instead of feeling intrusive, it felt like I was being heard, like the house appreciated my careful exploration. I smiled. "Yes, yes, I'll be gentle," I whispered to the empty room, mostly to humor myself. On one side of the hall stood a long table with a cracked vase on top. Inside were dried flowers, their petals curled delicately like ancient scrolls. They looked tired, but peaceful, a quiet dignity in their decay. It made me feel like maybe, just maybe, I was in the presence of calm souls, not ghosts. I glanced at the staircase again. The steps were wide and sturdy, polished once upon a time, now creaking with each tentative step. A tested one. Creak. Another. Creak. The house seemed to say, "Welcome. Be careful, but take your time." And I did. The hallway stretched further, lined with paintings and frames that had dimmed over the years. Portraits of people in fancy clothes stared down, not angrily or hauntingly, but with a quiet curiosity, as if to see whether the new visitor understood the pace of this house. I felt a twinge of connection, silly as that might sound, like the mansion was saying, "Ah, someone appreciates the stillness." I walked to a nearby window and peeked outside. The garden, once probably meticulously designed, had grown wild with time. Flowers and weeds mingled without care, trees leaned where they wanted, and the paths were soft under the twilight. It was beautiful, in an untamed sort of way. Margaret Ashgrove, if she were watching, would probably shake her head at the chaos, but smile anyway. The quiet made me notice everything. The slight creak of a floorboard, the faint smell of old stone, the soft patter of leaves outside. And I realized something important. This house wasn't scary. It didn't try to scare. It didn't even try to impress. It existed, patiently, holding stories, memories, whispers of long past days. And tonight, I was part of that calm. I took a deep breath and stepped further inside, ready to explore more. My eyes lingered on the chandelier again. Maybe it had once sparkled with candlelight, illuminating dinners and conversations. Maybe it had seen laughter, quiet tears, and moments too small to record in history books. I liked thinking that. It made the house feel alive, without needing to be loud or dramatic. As I wandered deeper into the entrance hall, I felt the first real connection with the mansion. Not fear, not rush, but curiosity, soft and lingering, the kind that invites you to walk slowly, look carefully, and listen quietly. A connection that asked nothing and gave everything in return. And so my night at the Ashgrove Mansion began, with soft steps, gentle whispers of history, and the comforting thought that time could move slowly, if just for a few hours, if you let it.
Stepping deeper into the mansion felt like stepping backward in time. The air was cooler now, carrying a quiet weight, as if the house had been storing centuries in its walls. I paused in the main hall and let my eyes wander. Light from the setting sun filtered softly through dusty windows, painting the floors with gold and orange stripes. It was peaceful, slow and unhurried, like the mansion itself was telling me to take my time. On the left side of the hall, I noticed a tall wooden door, slightly ajar. Pushing it open, I discovered a small study, or maybe a reading room, lined with shelves of books, rolled-up maps, and stacks of papers. Dust floated lazily in the air, moving as though it had nowhere urgent to be. In the corner sat a desk, worn and waiting patiently, like it had been expecting me. On the desk lay a large, leather-bound book, its cover cracked but still intact. I picked it up. The title read, "The Ashgrove Estate, a Chronicle." I smiled. Of course the mansion had a history book. If walls could talk, this one had clearly gone the extra mile and wrote a book too. Opening it, I found a hand-drawn sketch of the mansion. The building looked bright and clean in the drawing, its gardens perfectly arranged, fountains gleaming and windows sparkling. Somehow it looked cheerful, almost smug, like it was saying, "Look at me, back in my glory days." Beneath the sketch was a note. Completed in 1724 under Master Mason Elias Wenton. Older than most heating systems I've ever complained about, I thought. This place had literally survived centuries of winters, summers, and probably the occasional bad tea recipe. The book described the mansion's first owner, Lord Alastair Ashgrove, a man who wanted a quiet retreat away from the noise of the city. Apparently, cities back then were loud in their own way. Horses clopping, merchants shouting, townsfolk gossiping. Alastair didn't want any of that. He found a peaceful stretch of land, charmingly isolated, and decided to build a home. And build it he did. The mansion began simply: a central hall, 2 wings, a sturdy roof, and lots of windows to let in light. But over the years, each generation added their touch. A balcony here, an extra staircase there, a hallway leading nowhere, maybe just for fun. I imagine someone hundreds of years ago shrugging, saying, "Why not add a corridor? It could be mysterious." Turning the page, I found a hand-painted map of the estate. The gardens were huge back then, trimmed hedges, winding paths, and fountains that must have glittered in the sun. Now, of course, nature had taken over. Wildflowers and brave little weeds grew wherever they pleased, ignoring the original designs. I chuckled. Nature doesn't care for blueprints. The book went on to describe the Ashgroves' daily life. Calm and simple, mostly. They drank tea in the mornings, walked slowly in the gardens, and enjoyed quiet evenings by the fire. No grand drama, no scandal, just a life that moved at the speed of contentment. Even their neighbors in the village liked them. They helped with wells, shared food, and occasionally hosted small, gentle festivals on the lawn. A wholesome bunch, really. One page caught my eye. Notable events. It mentioned the year the gardens produced so many lemons that the family made pies every week. Another page described a small orchestra visiting the mansion, playing in the grand hall, the sound floating through the windows and echoing across the estate. Nothing scary, just soft music and soft memories. But then, a footnote at the bottom made me pause. The Night of the Whispers, 1812. I raised an eyebrow. Not dramatic yet, but intriguing. The text explained that several members of the household heard soft murmurs late at night. Not frightening, not alarming, just quiet voices echoing in the hallways. Searching the house revealed nothing, yet the murmuring continued for weeks. A servant's note in the margin read, "It is as if the house remembers old footsteps and tries to repeat them." I smiled. A house with memory. Not a haunted house, just a house that kept echoes of the past, like a grandparent humming forgotten lullabies. Peaceful, in a way, almost comforting. Flipping further, I found that the mansion had been built on older land. Before the Ashgroves arrived, traders and travelers often camped here, using the quiet fields as resting places, so maybe that's why the estate felt so calm, like the land itself had been trained in patience long before the walls were raised. A small sketch in the corner showed villagers carrying baskets, tending livestock, and walking carefully along the old roads. I imagined Alistair's polite nods, Margaret's gentle smile, children running barefoot, laughing. This was life centuries ago, ordinary, yet remarkable in its simplicity. The last major entry detailed the mansion's later years. The final Ashgrove descendant left in the late 1800s as the town grew and life changed. Various owners came and went, but none stayed long. Not because the house was scary, simply old, costly, and located in the middle of peaceful nowhere. Eventually, it was left alone, and alone it remained. I closed the book and let the silence of the room settle around me. The air smelled faintly of paper, wood, and time. Dust motes floated lazily in the fading light. The mansion's history was calm, full of quiet footsteps, gentle laughter, and echoes that lived longer than anyone who could remember them. I imagined the first owners walking these halls, reading, sewing, walking through gardens, or simply staring out the windows as the wind played through the trees. The house wasn't haunted. It didn't need to be. Its history itself was enough to fill the halls with memory. Stepping back into the hallway, I felt a strange connection. I wasn't just a visitor. I was part of this story now. Every creak beneath my feet, every soft whisper of wind against the windows, every shadow stretching in the fading light, they were all part of a mansion that remembered. The history wasn't dramatic. There were no battles, no tragedies, no screams echoing through the halls, just life. Quiet, ordinary, patient life. And I realized that this was exactly why I was drawn here, to walk slowly through a house that had learned to move at its own pace, letting me feel it in the rhythm of the floors, walls, and air. I lingered in the hall for a moment, imagining the people who had once lived here. Lord Alistair with his quiet demeanor, Lady Margaret tending her gardens, the children running through the hallways, and the servants moving softly in the background. Centuries had passed, and yet those echoes remained. And in that calm, I took a deep breath and stepped forward, ready to meet the next layer of history, the first owners themselves through the rooms and stories they left behind.
After spending some time in the study, I wandered back into the main hall, letting the calm of the mansion settle around me. Each step echoed softly against the stone and wood, a gentle reminder that this house had listened to countless footsteps before mine. Not ghosts, exactly, just memories imprinted in the walls, lingering like old music. I moved toward a side doorway, the kind that looked like it hadn't been opened in years but seemed almost hopeful, waiting for someone curious enough to peek inside. Pushing it gently, I stepped into a large room bathed in soft, fading light from tall windows. This had to be one of the original sitting rooms. The floorboards creaked in a lazy rhythm, welcoming me without urgency. The room smelled faintly of wood, old fabric, and something floral, maybe dried flowers left centuries ago. Dust floated in the air like tiny golden motes, catching the last rays of sunlight. It was quiet, peaceful, and patient, exactly how I imagined the first owners would have liked it. Speaking of them, Lord Alistair Ashgrove and his family, I tried to picture them moving through this space. Alistair was a man who cherished calm more than grandeur. He likely spent mornings in this very room reading a book or staring out the windows at the gardens beyond, thinking about life, trees, or perhaps whether the lemon trees were happy. Lady Margaret, his wife, probably moved about quietly, arranging flowers, tending to letters, and humming soft tunes while she worked. The children, if they were present, might have run lightly along the hallways, leaving soft laughter in their wake. On the far wall hung a large portrait of the family. Alistair, with a calm but slightly unsure expression, stood beside Margaret, whose soft gaze felt almost alive. The children were portrayed with quiet curiosity, one clutching a small wooden toy, the other holding a book. There was no pretense of drama in their expressions, no attempts to look intimidating or powerful. They looked gentle, content, and very much at home. I walked closer to the portrait, running my hand along the frame. A handwritten note at the bottom read, "A family of calm hearts." I couldn't help but smile. That explained everything. The mansion wasn't built to impress or intimidate. It was built for slow mornings, peaceful afternoons, and quiet evenings. A home where life's rhythm wasn't hurried. The furniture matched that same quiet energy. Chairs were worn but comfortable. Tables were polished smooth by generations of care. A fireplace, now cold, looked as though it had welcomed many evenings of soft conversation, gentle laughter, and perhaps even a few quiet tears. I imagined Alistair reading aloud from his favorite books, while Margaret worked on embroidery. The children might have been quietly drawing, or perhaps trying to sneak a treat from the kitchen. Everything was calm, orderly, and yet full of subtle life. I wandered over to a side table stacked with little wooden boxes, ribbons, and small keepsakes. Opening one, I found pressed flowers and a faded letter. The paper felt fragile, but intact, a small reminder that ordinary lives are still extraordinary when preserved. The letter, though mostly illegible, began with, "My dearest Margaret." I smiled again. Someone had poured their thoughts, hopes, and feelings into that page, trusting it would endure. And here it was, waiting quietly in a box, centuries later, a gentle connection across time. Curiosity led me to the windows. Outside, the garden stretched in soft chaos, flowers, weeds, and small trees growing in whatever way pleased them. I imagined Margaret tending them carefully, trimming and pruning. Alistair probably wandered the path slowly, noting which trees needed attention, which flowers bloomed best, and maybe whispering encouragement to the plants. The children would have been running around barefoot, laughing in ways that only children know how. And the servants, moving softly in the background, kept the house in its calm rhythm, lighting fires, polishing silver, and preparing meals. Everything in this house was slow, deliberate, and careful. Nothing rushed. Even the dust seemed polite. I sat down in a chair by the fireplace, letting it groan softly under me, as though stretching after centuries of stillness. I closed my eyes for a moment, imagining life in this room long ago. There were no dramatics, no high stakes, no urgent mysteries, just ordinary days filled with ordinary joys made extraordinary by the steady, patient walls that witnessed them. Opening my eyes, I noticed small details I hadn't seen before. The delicate carvings on the mantel, tiny scratches in the wood floor from generations of feet, faded stains where candle wax had spilled and been left to harden. Each imperfection told a story, a quiet story, a story that didn't need to shout. I imagined a late afternoon in the mansion, the sunlight soft against the walls, the fire crackling faintly, and Alistair slowly reading while Margaret stitched at her embroidery hoop. The children would have crept in occasionally, sharing a whispered secret or asking a quiet question. The house itself seemed to lean in, listening, holding every sound and step in patient memory. This, I realized, was the essence of the Ashgroves. They didn't make noise, they made life. They didn't need grandeur, they created calm. And this house, still standing centuries later, carried every echo, every sigh, every soft laugh with gentle respect. I stood and moved toward the next room, pausing at a small desk tucked in the corner. On it lay a few old journals and papers long untouched. They weren't dramatic, just accounts of everyday life. Notes about planting seasons, recipes for bread and lemon pies, reminders to water the herbs. I smiled, thinking about how even centuries later, such ordinary details felt intimate, personal, and soothing. Before leaving the room, I glanced once more at the family portrait. Their faces seemed softer now, more welcoming. They didn't watch me with suspicion or curiosity. They watched me with patience, as if saying, "Take your time. There's no need to rush." And so, I stepped back into the hall, feeling a sense of quiet companionship. The first owners had long since passed. The mansion had endured, yet somehow their calm, ordinary life had seeped into every wall, every floorboard, every shadow. It wasn't haunting. It wasn't unsettling. It was peace, preserved in wood, stone, and dust. I realized then that exploring this house wasn't about seeking excitement or fear.
It was about walking slowly, noticing carefully, and allowing history itself to settle around you. With that thought, I took a deep breath and continued onward, ready to discover the stories left behind by travelers, visitors, and local legends. Each layer of history seemed to invite me gently, softly, patiently. And I knew that the mansion had more stories to tell. Stories that didn't need to scream. Stories that simply needed someone willing to listen.
After lingering a while in the sitting room, I moved back into the hallway. The quiet was comfortable, almost like a soft blanket wrapping around me. The mansion had a way of making every step feel considered, every breath slower, every sound more noticeable. The floorboards creaked under my weight, but not in warning, more like gentle reminders that they had been here for centuries, patiently enduring the comings and goings of countless footsteps. My eyes were drawn to a small doorway tucked behind the staircase. It was half hidden in shadows, small enough to seem insignificant, yet somehow inviting. I opened it slowly and stepped inside. This room had the air of a forgotten office or reading nook. Wooden shelves lined the walls, overflowing with books, rolled maps, and stacks of papers that looked like they hadn't been touched in decades. Dust floated in lazy spirals, catching the soft light from a tiny window above like delicate golden sparks in the air. In the corner, a simple desk awaited, holding a small pile of letters tied together with a faded ribbon. I picked them up carefully. They felt fragile but preserved, the kind of papers that had survived countless years simply because they carried stories worth remembering. The first letter was dated 1791. It was from a traveler who had visited the mansion during a particularly stormy week. The handwriting was neat and slightly slanted, elegant in a way that made me imagine careful mornings and thoughtful tea. To the gracious household of Ashgrove, I thank you for hosting me during my travels. The roads were long and the nights cold, but your home felt like a resting place for the weary. I couldn't help but grin. A 5-star inn, minus the Wi-Fi, I whispered. The letter described evenings by the fireplace, soft conversations, and warm meals. The visitor even mentioned a faint music played by the family on a small piano in the sitting room. Nothing scary, nothing dramatic, just soft, everyday life, preserved in ink. The next letter, from 1805, was from a woman whose carriage had broken down nearby. She wrote about staying at the mansion and how the hallways seemed to hold echoes of the past. At first, I raised an eyebrow. Whispers? Shadows? But as I read on, I realized she didn't mean ghosts. She meant the house remembered footsteps, conversations, laughter, and quiet moments, as if the walls themselves stored the rhythm of life. She wrote, "It feels as though the walls have listened to centuries of gentle voices, and sometimes, if you stand still long enough, you can almost hear them again." I nodded. That made perfect sense. The mansion wasn't haunted. It was mindful. It had memory. I carefully placed the letters back on the desk and scanned the shelves. There were small journals tucked between larger books, travel logs from visitors spanning decades. Most described mundane things, meals, weather, gardens, but one stood out. A traveler had spent the night in the north guest room. Near dawn, he wrote, he awoke to soft footsteps outside his door. Slow, measured, purposeful. But when he opened the door, the hallway was empty. He scribbled, "The locals warned me before I arrived. The Ashgrove house remembers. I think I do now." I leaned back in my chair. A house that remembers. It wasn't frightening. It was comforting. There was something tender in the idea that a building could preserve echoes of life so carefully, so respectfully for centuries. On another shelf, I noticed a yellowed newspaper clipping folded into a book. The title read, "Village Tales, The Whispers of Ashgrove Manor." Of course, the villagers had stories. They always do. But these were soft stories, told over cups of tea in the afternoons, not around roaring fires at midnight.
The article explained that on calm nights, when the wind died down, some locals claimed they could hear gentle echoes of old conversations drifting through the halls. Not frightening, just present. One paragraph described a musician who had stayed for 3 nights in the mansion. He played his violin in the grand hall, filling the space with soft notes. The villagers said that on certain nights, the music could still be heard, faint and floating on the breeze, a gentle reminder of beauty long past. I smiled. A house filled with music, letters, footsteps, and memories. What a kind of haunting that was. It didn't seek to scare. It preserved life. It remembered. I reached for one last object on a low shelf, a small carved wooden box. Inside were a few coins, a tiny locket, and a folded piece of paper. It wasn't dramatic. The paper had a single line. Every visitor leaves a footprint, even if it cannot be seen. Simple, true, gentle. The mansion wasn't a place of terror or mystery. It was a vessel for time, holding the footprints of those who came before and leaving them quietly for those who followed. As I set the box back, I felt a sense of calm sweep over me. The mansion's stories weren't about fear or adventure. They were about memory, presence, and the gentle touch of ordinary life. Letters, journals, music, footsteps, every little thing carried meaning. Every visitor left a mark, whether they knew it or not. I stood and walked to the window, peering out at the garden. The sun had slipped further below the horizon, leaving long, purple shadows. Flowers and weeds stretched lazily in the dim light, swaying slightly in the soft evening breeze. I imagined the travelers, the Ashgrove family, the villagers, all of them moving through this space, leaving behind the faintest echoes of who they were. A feeling of quiet companionship settled over me. The mansion didn't need me to understand everything. It simply welcomed me to notice, to listen, and to move slowly through its history. I walked back into the hallway, brushing my hand along the wall. The house seemed to hum softly, not in sound, but in presence. It remembered, and now I did too. The whispers of past visitors, gentle echoes of ordinary lives, and the soft wisdom of time itself, all of it lived here. Not threatening, not eerie, just persistent, patient, and calm. And as I wandered deeper, I realized something important. Every letter, every journal, every local story contributed to the house's memory. It was alive in a quiet way, preserving humanity, gentleness, and everyday life for anyone who cared to notice. The mansion's charm wasn't in grandeur or fear. It was in its patience, its memory, and its quiet insistence that life, even ordinary life, deserves to be remembered. I took a slow, deep breath. Somewhere in the distance, a floorboard creaked softly. Not alarmingly, just naturally, like a note in an unfinished song. The house had more stories to tell, more echoes to share, and I was ready to follow them.
The sun had slipped completely behind the trees now, leaving the Ashgrove mansion bathed in the gentle hues of twilight. The garden outside had grown almost shadowy, the wildflowers and untamed grass blending into soft shades of green and purple. Even the air seemed to change. It was cooler, heavier, but not in a frightening way, more like a slow sigh after a long day. The mansion, standing tall and still, seemed to inhale the evening alongside me. I lingered in the hallway, letting the quiet settle in. The house had always felt alive, but now it seemed more alert. Not menacing, just more aware of itself. The fading light made the wooden panels and the faded wallpaper glow softly, highlighting every curve and imperfection. Each step I took on the floorboards let out a muted creak, a gentle announcement that I was still here, still observing. I moved toward one of the tall windows. Outside, the garden was almost indistinguishable from the shadows. The wind rustled the leaves lazily, producing soft whispers that mingled with the house's own quiet. It wasn't eerie. It was contemplative, like nature itself was leaning in to watch the mansion settle for the night. The first thing I noticed was how the light changed everything. Shadows stretched long across the floors, softening the edges of furniture, walls, and staircases. The portraits on the walls, which had seemed stiff and distant during the day, now felt calmer. Their painted eyes seemed less like silent judges and more like old friends, quietly observing the passage of time. I wandered into the grand entrance hall, moving slowly. The chandelier above hung silently, catching the moonlight in its dusty crystals, scattering gentle fragments of silver across the floor. It looked almost magical, as if the mansion itself had a quiet sense of humor. I imagined the chandelier swinging slightly on a windy night centuries ago, tossing light across the room while the Ashgrove family read or sipped tea. The floorboards groaned under my careful steps. I half smiled and whispered, "Yes, yes, I know. You're old and proud, but still listening." The air had shifted slightly, carrying the scent of the stone walls cooling in the evening. There was a softness to it, a smell that mixed faintly with the lingering warmth of the day. I could almost hear it settling, like a gentle hum beneath the ordinary sounds of a quiet house. I moved into one of the side rooms, a sitting area that probably saw many evenings of calm conversation. A small fireplace sat dormant, its stones darkened with the memory of centuries of fires. I imagined the Ashgroves gathered here long ago, perhaps talking in low voices or sharing gentle laughter. The children may have been quietly reading or whispering secrets, and the servants might have been tending to small chores, moving softly in the background. Nightfall seemed to deepen every detail. The shadows danced slowly across the walls, making ordinary objects feel alive in a subdued way. A table with a few wooden boxes seemed to lean in slightly, curious about my presence. I smiled. The mansion wasn't trying to be dramatic. It was simply observing, patient, quiet, gentle. I stepped into the hallway again and noticed the faintest creak from the stairs. Not startling, just soft, deliberate. Perhaps it was the wood settling, or perhaps it was a ghost of past footsteps lingering in the boards. Either way, it felt peaceful, like the mansion was sharing a quiet moment with me. I approached a small window and looked out at the garden once more. The shadows had thickened, but the shapes were soft, almost welcoming. The branches swayed lazily, and I imagined the leaves brushing each other, like friends greeting after a long day. There was a sense of rhythm in the air, the wind, the trees, the house itself, all moving in slow harmony. As the night deepened, the mansion revealed more of its gentle quirks. The long corridors seemed to stretch dreamily, their ends softened by shadow. Doors, slightly ajar, suggested that someone had moved through them long ago, leaving traces of footsteps that time had preserved like invisible threads. I imagined travelers, Ashgrove family members, and servants, all moving quietly through these spaces, each leaving behind a subtle echo. The portraits along the hallways took on a softer presence. Faces that had looked rigid during the day now seemed relaxed. Gentle smiles, calm gazes, and serene expressions met mine in muted welcome. The house wasn't haunted in a traditional sense. It was alive with memory, a memory that whispered, softly, to anyone willing to notice. I wandered to a corner of the hall where the light was dimmer. Here, the shadows seemed to gather in quiet clusters, forming shapes that almost suggested movement, but there was nothing alarming about them. They were subtle, playful even. Tiny reminders that time had passed here and life had left delicate traces everywhere. I paused near the grand staircase. The railing felt cool under my hand, worn smooth by countless touches over the years. The steps themselves were sturdy, groaning faintly as if stretching after a long, patient nap. I could almost hear the faintest echoes of long-ago footsteps,
Servants carrying trays, children running to greet a parent, a lister taking slow, thoughtful walks in his study. The mansion had changed with the evening, but not in a way meant to startle. Its personality shifted slowly, almost imperceptibly. The rooms became softer, the air heavier yet soothing, the shadows more embracing. It was a transformation that reminded me of settling into bed after a long day. Gentle, inevitable, comforting. I took a deep breath and felt my own pace slow. My steps softened, my breathing eased, even my thoughts seemed to settle into a gentler rhythm, matching the mansion's own. It was a house that demanded nothing but attention, patience, and quiet appreciation. And as the night deepened, I realized something important. The Ash Grove mansion was not about fear or excitement. It was about being present, about noticing, about walking slowly through a space that had lived centuries and letting the stillness wrap around you like a warm blanket. I paused in the hallway one last time before moving toward another wing. The house seemed to exhale, its shadows stretching comfortably across the walls, welcoming me to continue exploring. Nightfall had arrived, and with it, the mansion had revealed its true rhythm. Patient, calm, and beautifully alive in memory and presence. Every creak, every whisper of wind, every long shadow, it was all part of the mansion's soft heartbeat. And for the first time, I felt that heartbeat in sync with my own. With that, I took my first careful steps into the next corridor, ready to discover the grand hall, the whispering corridors, and the many subtle stories that waited patiently in the dark.
The grand hall of the Ash Grove mansion stretched before me, silent and patient. The ceiling rose high above, adorned with wooden beams carved long ago with intricate designs that had softened with age. Dust floated in slow spirals in the fading moonlight, catching every curve of the carvings and turning them into delicate patterns. I took a deep breath, feeling the calm settle around me like a soft blanket. The room smelled of polished wood, stone, and faint traces of long-extinguished candles. It wasn't musty, as one might expect in an old house. Instead, it had a quiet warmth, a reminder that countless people had walked these floors, whispered here, laughed softly, and left their presence behind, not as a disturbance, but as a gentle imprint. A massive chandelier hung in the center of the hall. Its crystals were dulled with dust, but still elegant, catching stray moonlight and scattering soft reflections across the floor. I could almost imagine the chandelier gleaming in its original glory, candles lit on cold winter evenings, the light dancing across happy faces. It seemed to hum silently with the memory of its past brilliance. Along the walls, faded carpets traced the length of the hall, patterned with muted reds and blues. The colors had dulled over centuries, yet they carried their own quiet charm. My footsteps made soft thuds against the floor, echoing in the large space. Each sound felt amplified, not in a startling way, but in a manner that made me conscious of the mansion's patient listening. I wandered closer to the walls and studied the portraits hanging there. Some were family members, others unknown visitors, all depicted with calm expressions. Their painted eyes seemed to follow me, but not in a threatening way. Instead, it felt like they were quietly observing, welcoming me into the mansion's rhythm. I imagined the people in these portraits walking the hall long ago, Alistair in his tailored coat, Margaret gently arranging flowers, children running barefoot in soft delight. The fireplace at the far end of the hall drew my attention next. Cold now, but once it had crackled warmly with flames, filling the room with golden light and a comforting scent of wood smoke. I could almost see a family gathered around it, sharing quiet conversation, sipping warm tea, or simply enjoying each other's presence. The space didn't need dramatic action. The ordinary life of its occupants had been enough to fill the hall with energy and memory. As I explored, I noticed small, delicate details, the carved patterns along the banisters of the staircase, tiny scratches on the floorboards that hinted at long-forgotten games or hurried steps, and faint impressions in the wood where furniture had rested for decades. Each imperfection told a story, not loud or frightening, just gentle traces of life, carefully preserved. I moved to a smaller alcove off the main hall, where a table held old letters and journals.
Carefully opening one, I found notes from travelers who had visited the mansion centuries ago. Some described the calm of the gardens, others wrote about the soft meals they shared with the Ashgroves. One traveler mentioned the grand hall itself, saying it felt as though the room listened, remembering each step and each whispered word. I smiled softly. The house didn't just hold memories, it preserved them. The moonlight streaming through tall windows revealed subtle patterns in the dusty air, as if the house itself were breathing quietly. Shadows shifted slowly, creating gentle shapes on the walls and floor. It was mesmerizing. I imagined these shadows long ago, as candlelight flickered against them. The effect must have been enchanting, comforting, and maybe a little magical. I paused near a massive doorway that led to what seemed like another corridor. The wood there was polished smooth by centuries of hands, each touch leaving its subtle mark. I ran my fingers lightly over the frame, imagining the many people who had passed through, servants, guests, family members, all moving with soft purpose. The mansion had seen their lives unfold in ordinary moments, yet those ordinary moments had accumulated into something extraordinary. Centuries of calm, patient life preserved in wood, stone, and shadow. I glanced back at the chandelier again, noting the way its crystals scattered light across the floor. I imagined the family standing beneath it for formal portraits or celebrations, the glow of candles reflecting in their eyes. The children might have tiptoed beneath it, pretending it was a magical tree, while servants bustled quietly in the background. Every creak, every shadow, every faint reflection in the crystals carried a story that one told softly and without urgency. Walking across the hall, I noticed a tiny scratch along the edge of a carpet, almost hidden. I wondered if it had been made by a child chasing a toy, or maybe by a nervous servant hurrying along. These little imperfections, not noticed by most, were treasures for someone who paid attention. They were gentle reminders that life had happened here, in soft, ordinary ways, and that the mansion remembered. I moved toward a corner where a small chair sat near a side table. On it were a few objects, a quill, a small inkwell, and a stack of folded letters. Picking one up, I read quietly, "Thank you for your hospitality. The house is serene beyond words, and I leave with memories to last a lifetime." I placed the letter down carefully. This was the essence of the Ashgrove mansion. Not drama, not fear, not grandeur for the sake of impressing anyone, just life lived gently, quietly, and memorably. As I wandered the grand hall one last time, I let my eyes roam over every detail. The fading carpets, the portraits, the fireplace, the chandelier, the tiny imperfections in the wood. The mansion wasn't trying to impress, it wasn't trying to frighten, it simply existed, patiently, gracefully, and in rhythm with time. And in that quiet, I realized something profound. The grand hall wasn't just a room, it was a vessel, a place where centuries of life, laughter, soft steps, and whispered conversations had accumulated, layering over one another like soft blankets. And tonight, I was part of that rhythm, a gentle footstep among countless others, welcomed into the calm heartbeat of the mansion. I took a deep breath, feeling the slow pace of the mansion settle into me. The grand hall had revealed its essence, quiet presence, memory, and soft beauty. There was no need for noise or drama here. Life itself, lived in patience and observation, had been enough. With that thought, I stepped toward the next corridor, ready to follow the whispers of history into the famous hallway known as the Whispering Corridor. Every step was soft, deliberate, and in harmony with the gentle rhythm of the Ashgrove mansion.
From the grand hall, I moved slowly toward a narrow passageway, known in the mansion stories as the Whispering Corridor. Even the name was gentle, inviting curiosity rather than alarm. The doorway framed it in shadow, and I felt a small thrill, not of fear, but of anticipation. What secrets did this corridor hold? Or perhaps it was simpler than that. Perhaps it held only memories, quietly waiting for someone to notice them. The corridor stretched long and dimly lit by the faint glow of moonlight through tiny windows. The walls were lined with faded wooden panels, each scratched and marked over centuries. Dust lay in soft layers along the floor, disturbed only by my careful footsteps.
The air smelled faintly of aged wood, old stone, and something floral, like pressed flowers stored for decades. It was calming, almost as if the corridor had its own gentle fragrance, a scent meant to slow your breathing and encourage quiet reflection. I stepped inside, feeling the soft hush of the passage wrap around me. The light and shadows played across the walls in slow, shifting patterns. My own movements echoed lightly, bouncing off the walls, but not in a startling way. Instead, it felt as though the corridor was listening, noting my presence without judgment or hurry. Local legends said that the corridor was famous for soft whispers that echoed through its length, but I quickly learned that these whispers weren't frightening. They weren't voices of ghosts or spirits trying to scare anyone. They were subtle traces of history, conversations, laughter, footsteps, and sighs preserved in the house itself. A visitor centuries ago had remarked that walking through the corridor felt like walking among echoes of gentle memories. I paused midway and imagined the corridor alive with the soft rhythms of past lives. Perhaps a servant had once carried a tray through this very passage, stepping carefully to avoid disturbing the children playing in the rooms beyond. Perhaps a young member of the Ashgrove family tiptoed down the corridor to deliver a note, the soft rustle of paper blending with the quiet creaks of the wood. The corridor remembered all these small movements, keeping them patient and intact for anyone willing to notice them. A faint draft swirled around me, carrying whispers of the past. Not scary, not eerie, just soft, curious sounds, like a memory brushing lightly against the edges of my awareness. I smiled. The corridor wasn't haunted, it was thoughtful. It had listened to centuries of life, and now it offered that gentle presence to anyone who walked its length. Small details caught my eye. A tiny nick in the wood, a faintly scuffed floorboard, a shadow cast at just the right angle by the moonlight. These were the corridor's way of sharing its stories. They were whispers, not screams, hints, not alarms. I felt a sense of quiet companionship with the passageway, as though it had known me all along. I moved further along, letting the corridor guide me slowly. The far end appeared softened by darkness, the shapes of doors and windows merging gently into shadow. I imagined people moving through this space hundreds of years ago, the soft shuffle of shoes on wood, the faint murmur of conversation, the hush of someone trying not to wake a sleeping child. It was ordinary life preserved in extraordinary patience. I stopped near a small window halfway down the corridor. Moonlight spilled in, illuminating floating dust motes like tiny stars. I rested my hand on the wall, feeling the cool wood beneath my fingers. The corridor seemed to respond, holding the memory of every hand that had passed along its surface before mine. Each one left a trace, faint but enduring, a silent reminder of lives lived in quiet moments. On one side, I noticed a faded note pinned to a wooden panel. Carefully, I read it. The corridor remembers. Do not hurry. Listen, and you will hear it. I smiled softly. That was exactly what I was doing. Listening, noticing, moving slowly. No rush, no drama, just presence. As I continued, I imagined how the Ashgrove family might have used this corridor. Perhaps it connected the bedrooms to the main hall, offering a quiet route for late-night trips to the study or the gardens. Perhaps visitors had walked here after tea, lingering to admire the soft architecture and gentle shadows. I pictured servants moving silently with trays, careful not to disturb the calm rhythm of the household. Even the faint creaks of the floorboard seemed purposeful, like soft punctuation marks in a story written by time itself. I took another slow step, and felt the rhythm of the mansion's memory wrap around me, comforting and serene. The whispering corridor was alive, but not in a startling way. Alive with patience, observation, and subtle echoes of ordinary life. A gentle gust of wind entered through a slightly open window, brushing my hair against my face. It carried a faint scent of the garden outside, earthy, floral, calm. I breathed it in slowly, letting the corridor guide my thoughts. In this place, there was no hurry. There was no noise, just the soft accumulation of centuries resting in the wood, the walls, the air itself. I imagined travelers from long ago tiptoeing through this corridor, whispering their thanks for hospitality, or perhaps passing messages between rooms. Children might have giggled softly, their laughter absorbed into the wood. Even moments of quiet frustration or mild annoyance, like spilled ink or misplaced letters, had been gently preserved, now softened by time. The corridor's whispers were subtle, almost imperceptible, yet profound. They weren't trying to scare. They weren't trying to demand attention. They simply existed, patiently, like a river flowing slowly over centuries. And for anyone who walked its length, the experience was humbling, gentle, and deeply calming. I stopped near the end of the corridor, letting the darkness and moonlight blend softly around me. I could almost hear centuries of life brushing past, not in alarm or urgency, but in quiet rhythm. Each step, each whisper, each memory was held gently here, waiting for a visitor willing to notice. Taking a deep breath, I realized that the whispering corridor was not merely a hallway. It was a storyteller. Its tales were subtle, slow, and soothing, perfect for anyone seeking calm rather than fright. And as I prepared to leave, I felt an unspoken invitation. The mansion had more whispers to share, more gentle echoes waiting in the abandoned guest rooms, the old library, and beyond. With that thought, I stepped carefully toward the next room, carrying with me the serene presence of the corridor. Its whispers lingered softly, not in my ears, but in my mind, reminding me that life, even centuries later, could still speak, softly and patiently, to anyone willing to listen. Leaving the whispering corridor behind, I found myself facing a set of doors that led to the guest rooms. They were smaller than the grand halls and corridors I had explored so far, but no less captivating. In fact, the intimacy of these spaces made them feel more alive, though in a quiet, patient way. I felt as if the mansion had saved these rooms just for me, to share their calm stories of visitors long gone. The first door creaked softly as I pushed it open, revealing a modest room with a large, canopied bed that had seen far too many years to be considered new. The bedding was faded, dust motes dancing lazily above it in the gentle light that filtered through partially closed shutters. The walls were painted a soft cream, now slightly yellowed with age, and small floral patterns peeked out in the corners. It was cozy in a forgotten sort of way. The air smelled faintly of old wood, linens, and something floral, perhaps a leftover perfume from a visitor centuries ago. I could imagine someone unpacking a trunk here, setting down personal belongings, and sighing with relief after a long journey. The room was not luxurious, but it was welcoming, a temporary home that still carried warmth in the quietest corners. On a small table by the window sat a few objects, a brass candle holder, a half-faded journal, and a tiny wooden box. I picked up the journal carefully. Its pages were brittle but readable, filled with delicate handwriting that spoke of a traveler's reflections during their stay. "The house is kind," one entry read. "I hear the soft creaks of the floorboards and feel the gentle sway of history around me. It is comforting, like being cradled in a story too large to be told all at once. I smiled. That was exactly how it felt. Not spooky, not eerie, simply filled with presence and memory. The mansion preserved everything in a soft embrace, from the largest ballroom to the smallest guest room. The second room was slightly larger, with twin beds neatly made in the style of the late 1700s. Dust had settled thickly along the windowsill, and the wallpaper had begun to peel at the corners, curling like slow, careful fingers. A small trunk sat at the foot of one bed, and its brass fittings glinted softly in the fading light. I imagined travelers from decades past opening it carefully, removing clothing and personal items, laying them gently across the bed. Beside the bed lay a folded letter, its paper yellowed but intact. It read, "I feel as though this room remembers my footsteps. Even though I leave, a part of me lingers in the quiet corners." I chuckled softly. The mansion seemed to enjoy preserving moments in miniature, from entire parties in the grand hall down to a single traveler pausing to enjoy a quiet night's rest. The guest rooms were no exception. They were small repositories of calm memories, preserved like treasures in delicate wood and soft shadows. The third room had a large arched window overlooking the overgrown garden. Moonlight streamed in, illuminating patterns on the floor where furniture had once been moved. The scent here was slightly different, a mix of wood, linen, and the faint, earthy smell of the garden outside. I could imagine visitors opening this window at night, letting the cool air drift in and listening to the distant rustle of trees. The room seemed alive with quiet anticipation, as though it awaited the next gentle footsteps to enter and become part of its memory. Small details caught my eye: a chipped vase, a frayed curtain tied back with a faded ribbon, tiny scratches in the wooden floor. These marks weren't signs of neglect, they were signs of life lived quietly. Someone had leaned on this table, written a letter, or traced a finger along the edge of the wood. The mansion remembered, gently, without judgment or urgency. I wandered slowly from room to room, noticing how each space carried its own unique character. Some rooms had more sunlight during the day, while others seemed perfectly content in shadows. Each room was a quiet witness to human life. Travelers arriving tired from long journeys, families visiting the ash groves, or servants quietly preparing spaces for guests. Every detail, every object, every faded scent was part of a story. In the corner of the final guest room, I found a small, simple chair. On it rested a single book, its cover cracked and faded. Opening it, I found notes from various visitors, all recording their experiences. One traveler wrote about the soft creak of the floorboards at night, the gentle sway of shadows, and the comforting feeling that the house listened without judgment. Another described the faint scent of the garden that drifted in through the window, mingling with the wood and linens to create a sense of calm they had never experienced elsewhere. The mansion wasn't trying to impress, it wasn't trying to frighten. It simply existed as a quiet keeper of time, memory, and gentle human presence. And in the abandoned guest rooms, I felt that presence most strongly. It wasn't dramatic, it wasn't eerie, it was simply patient, comforting, and persistent. I paused in the doorway of the last guest room and looked back along the hall of guest rooms. The shadows stretched long across the floors, softened by moonlight. Each room held echoes of laughter, whispered conversations, quiet sighs, and the faint rhythms of ordinary life. The mansion had preserved them all, patiently and gracefully, waiting for someone willing to notice. As I stepped back into the hallway, I felt a sense of connection, not just to the people who had stayed here, but to the house itself. It had witnessed centuries of quiet lives, small joys and soft routines, and it had preserved them all, without fuss or drama. I realized then that the mansion's power didn't lie in grandeur or mystery. It lay in its ability to remember, patiently and kindly, the lives that had touched it. And as I moved toward the next part of the house, the old library and hidden notes, I carried with me the calm, patient presence of the abandoned guest rooms. Their quiet stories whispered softly, gently guiding me forward, one careful step at a time.
From the hallway of guest rooms, I wandered toward a heavy wooden door tucked into a corner of the mansion. Its brass handle was worn smooth from centuries of use, and it bore faint carvings of vines curling delicately across its surface. With a gentle push, the door creaked open, revealing the mansion's library, a sanctuary of quiet wisdom, aged paper, and calm. The air inside smelled of old books, polished wood, and the faint, lingering scent of candle wax. Dust floated in tiny golden motes, catching the soft moonlight streaming through tall, narrow windows. Shelves stretched from floor to ceiling, each one lined with rows of leather-bound tomes and volumes of varying sizes. Some leaned lazily against one another, as if too tired to stand perfectly upright after centuries of holding knowledge. I stepped carefully into the room, letting the quiet settle around me. This was a place that demanded nothing but observation and patience. Every sound seemed amplified yet gentle. The soft scrape of my shoes on the wooden floor, the faint rustle of pages as I brushed my hand against a nearby shelf, the subtle creak of the floorboards beneath me. Even the air felt alive, as though it carried whispers of countless readers who had once sat here, turning pages with quiet reverence. In one corner, a wooden desk stood under a tall window. On it lay a few scattered papers, a quill, and an inkpot that had long since dried. Beside them, a small journal caught my attention. Its leather cover was worn and cracked, and the edges of the pages had yellowed with time. I opened it carefully, revealing handwritten notes that spoke softly of everyday life in the mansion centuries ago. Today, I arranged the books on the shelves by size rather than topic. It pleases the eye and calms the mind. Even the smallest order brings a sense of peace. I smiled softly. Here, in this quiet library, the simplest acts, arranging books, cataloging letters, noting small details, were celebrated. The mansion preserved not just grand events, but subtle, ordinary life. I wandered between the shelves, running my fingers along spines of books. Some titles were in faded gold lettering. Others had long since lost their names to time. One shelf held books on gardening, another on astronomy, a few on poetry and philosophy. Each volume was a window into the minds and lives of people long gone, yet somehow still present in this serene space. Between two larger books, I noticed a small piece of paper tucked away, half hidden. Carefully, I pulled it out. It was a note, written in neat cursive. If you find this, know that someone once paused here thinking quietly of the world beyond these walls. Take a moment to breathe, to notice, and to remember. I felt a quiet thrill, not of fear, but of connection. The library had been more than a repository of knowledge. It was a place for reflection, for gentle observation, for listening to the soft heartbeat of the mansion itself. Moving toward the center of the room, I noticed a tall ladder resting against a shelf. I climbed it slowly, feeling the smooth, warm rungs beneath my hands. At the top, I discovered a hidden nook with a small stack of journals. Each one held careful records of daily life, notes about meals, gardens, weather, visitors, and small household events.
Nothing dramatic, nothing frightening, simply the rhythm of ordinary life preserved with love. One journal entry described a visitor from the nearby village who had stayed in the mansion during a particularly rainy week. The rain patters gently on the roof, and I sit by the window, listening to its soft rhythm. It is peaceful here. The mansion carries the calm of many years, and I feel privileged to be part of its quiet story, even for a short time. I smiled. That was exactly what I felt now, privileged, calm, and embraced by the mansion's gentle presence. The library also held hidden treasures, tiny notes tucked between pages, forgotten letters slipped behind shelves, and small objects left behind by visitors. Each discovery was a whisper from the past, soft and patient, waiting for someone willing to notice. A pressed flower here, a folded letter there, a tiny sketch in pencil, all reminders that ordinary life, observed and preserved, is a story worth remembering. I wandered to the fireplace, its stone surround darkened with soot from centuries of fires. A single candlestick rested on the mantel, its wax hardened into delicate curves. I imagined the Ashgrove family sitting here in quiet evenings, reading aloud, discussing small details of life, or simply enjoying the warm glow. Perhaps a visitor had scribbled a note to record a fleeting thought or feeling, knowing that the library would keep it safe for centuries. As I explored, I felt the mansion's presence more acutely. It wasn't watching me in a threatening way. It was patient, gentle, and welcoming. Every shelf, every book, every note whispered its story slowly, allowing me to absorb it without hurry. The library was a testament to the mansion's character, calm, reflective, and endlessly observant. I found a small table near the window and sat down, running my hand over a stack of papers. Each one carried faint impressions of pens and pencils from long ago, yet the words remained soft, readable, and serene. I imagined countless hands holding quills, dipping them carefully into ink and writing thoughts meant to endure. The mansion had preserved them all, not as curiosities, but as quiet companions for anyone who chose to notice. Finally, I stepped toward the window, looking out at the garden bathed in moonlight. The soft rustle of leaves and distant creak of a branch added to the library's gentle symphony. I realized then that the room itself was alive with memory, not in a frightening sense, but in a deeply comforting way. Each note, journal, and hidden message connected me to centuries of calm, ordinary life. Taking a slow breath, I closed the journal and placed it back carefully on the shelf. I had spent a long time in the library, yet I could have lingered much longer. Its quiet stories were endless, each one a gentle invitation to pause, reflect, and appreciate the calm rhythm of life preserved in this mansion. Rising, I moved toward the door, carrying the soft presence of the library with me. Its hidden notes, journals, and carefully arranged volumes whispered a final thought as I left. Life, observed patiently and preserved with care, is always worth noticing. And the mansion had done this for centuries, patiently waiting for those willing to walk slowly, breathe gently, and listen. As I stepped back into the hallway, I knew that the mansion had more to share. The soft hush of midnight, the quiet stories of the servants' quarters, and the small secrets hidden in staircases and bedrooms. And I was ready to continue, following the mansion's gentle rhythm deeper into the night.
The mansion felt different now. Midnight had arrived, draping every room and corridor in a soft, silvery quiet.
The moonlight streamed through tall windows, painting the walls with elongated shadows that seemed to stretch lazily, as if the house itself were sighing and settling into its nightly rhythm. There was no hurry, no drama, just a gentle calm that made each creak of the floorboard and rustle of a curtain feel like part of a timeless lullaby. I walked slowly through the halls, letting the quiet embrace me. The mansion at night had a way of magnifying the little things: the faint echo of footsteps, the soft rustle of wind through slightly open windows, the distant ticking of a clock somewhere beyond my line of sight. Each sound was subtle, almost like the house itself was reminding me to slow down, breathe, and pay attention. In the grand hall, moonlight touched the chandelier, scattering tiny fragments of silver across the worn carpets. The portraits on the walls seemed calmer now, their painted eyes softened by shadows. Faces that had looked stiff or formal in the daytime now carried a quiet warmth, as if acknowledging my presence without expectation. I imagined the Ashgrove family centuries ago walking through these same halls, moving with soft purpose, their evenings full of calm routines and gentle conversation. I paused near the fireplace, noting the cool, quiet stone and the faint, lingering scent of long-extinguished fires. It was comforting. I imagined the hearth once alive with warm flames, the golden glow illuminating family gatherings, quiet readings, or the soft laughter of children. Even the faintest trace of that warmth seemed to linger in the room, as though the mansion itself preserved small moments of serenity for those who came later. The corridors were particularly mesmerizing at this hour. Shadows mingled with moonlight, forming soft patterns on walls and floors that shifted slowly with the night breeze. I walked through the whispering corridor again, noticing how its subtle echoes, once faint whispers of footsteps and conversation, seemed even more deliberate now. They weren't alarming or eerie, just soft reminders that life had been lived here and the mansion remembered it all. I passed the abandoned guest rooms, now silent in the moonlight. The beds lay untouched, their faded linens holding quiet impressions of visitors long gone. I imagined guests turning over in their sleep centuries ago, dreaming softly, the gentle rhythm of their breathing absorbed by the walls. The mansion preserved it all: the mundane, the ordinary, the calm essence of life itself. Moving to the old library, I noticed how the shadows shifted over the shelves. Each book, each journal, each hidden note seemed to glow softly in the pale light, as if whispering their stories to the quiet night. I ran my fingers along the spines, feeling the history preserved in leather and paper. Even the smallest details, the curl of a page, the faint indentation of a pen, carried weight and meaning. The mansion's basement and servant quarters, often overlooked during the day, seemed more alive than ever. I imagined the gentle routines of the past: servants moving quietly through corridors, preparing meals, tending fires, or checking on guests. Their footsteps, careful and deliberate, had left echoes that now mingled with mine in a soft symphony of time. The mansion preserved not just grand events, but everyday life, its rhythms, its small joys, its quiet beauty. I stopped near a window and peered out at the garden. The moonlight illuminated the overgrown flowers and tall grass, creating soft, gentle patterns on the earth. The wind rustled the leaves, producing a delicate chorus that blended seamlessly with the mansion's own subtle sounds. I imagined visitors long ago sitting at this very window, watching the garden, listening to the night, and feeling the calm embrace of the house. A distant clock chimed softly, marking the hour, but its sound was not jarring. Instead, it became part of the mansion's gentle rhythm, a reminder that even time moved patiently here. Every detail seemed deliberate, as if the house wanted nothing more than to be observed and appreciated. I wandered back into the grand hall, listening to the soft hum of silence, punctuated only by the occasional creak of the floorboards or whisper of the wind. The mansion at midnight was not lonely. It was contemplative,
reflective, and deeply alive in its own quiet way. I could feel the weight of centuries, not as a burden, but as a presence that invited me to slow down and be present myself. In the corner, I noticed a small, half-hidden note tucked under a faded carpet edge. I bent down carefully and read it. Midnight holds no fear here, only calm, observation, and the gentle rhythm of life preserved in patience. Walk slowly, breathe deeply, and listen. I smiled softly. That was exactly what I was doing. Midnight in the Ash Grove mansion was not about fright or suspense. It was about presence, memory, and the subtle beauty of ordinary life. Every creak, every whisper of wind, every moonlit shadow carried a story, and all of them were gentle, patient, and welcoming. I continued to wander, letting my steps fall softly on the polished floors. The mansion seemed to breathe with me, its quiet rhythm syncing with my own. I imagined the Ashgroves sleeping peacefully in their rooms, the servants' quiet tasks completed for the night, and the moonlight playing across the walls, and the house holding all these moments with serene patience. Even the smallest spaces, like the hidden staircases and forgotten closets, seemed alive at this hour. I imagined a traveler centuries ago, pausing here, wondering at the mansion's quiet mysteries, and feeling the gentle embrace of history. Every shadow, every texture, every subtle sound was preserved patiently by the mansion, waiting for someone to notice. Finally, I paused near a window in the grand hall, taking a slow, deep breath. The moonlight illuminated the room in silver hues, casting gentle shadows over the walls and furniture. I realized then that midnight was the mansion's true rhythm, slow, deliberate, calm, and endlessly patient. It was a reminder that life, even centuries later, could be appreciated in small, quiet moments. With that thought, I stepped forward, ready to explore the servant quarters below and the hidden corners of the mansion. Midnight had set the pace, and I was in perfect harmony with it, slow, calm, and fully immersed in the gentle heartbeat of the Ashgrove mansion.
From the grand hall, I descended a narrow staircase leading to the lower wing of the mansion. The air grew cooler and a little damper as I stepped carefully onto the worn wooden floorboards. This part of the house had a very different personality from the upper floors. It was quieter, simpler, and somehow more intimate, a place where ordinary life had been lived with routine, patience, and gentle care. The servants' quarters were modest. The ceilings were lower, and the rooms were smaller than those upstairs, but there was a warmth here that made the space feel welcoming. The walls were plain, painted in soft colors that had faded with time, and the furniture, though simple, had been crafted with care. Beds with neatly tucked blankets, small wooden chairs, and plain tables told the story of everyday life, unembellished yet full of quiet dignity. I wandered slowly through the first room. A bed sat against one wall, its linens neatly folded, though slightly frayed at the edges. A small chest at the foot of the bed had clearly held someone's personal belongings, a few pieces of clothing, a pair of worn shoes, and a small handkerchief. I imagined a servant waking early, stretching slightly, and stepping quietly into the kitchen or laundry room. The air smelled faintly of wood, earth, and the subtle scent of old linens, comforting and homey. Nearby, a simple table held a few scattered objects, a candlestick, a small wooden bowl, and a journal tucked partially under the edge of the table. I opened the journal carefully. Its pages were filled with notes about daily routines, meals prepared for the family, schedules of cleaning, laundry, and small observations about visitors. There was nothing dramatic here, only ordinary life preserved patiently, quietly, like a heartbeat echoing through centuries. One entry read,
The master of the house prefers his tea precisely at 4 o'clock. It is a small ritual, but it brings calm to the entire household. I smiled softly. Even in the midst of servitude, there was rhythm, order, and a gentle sense of pride in their work. The mansion preserved these subtle details alongside the grand halls and guest rooms, reminding anyone willing to notice that every life, no matter how humble, left traces worth remembering. I moved to the second room, which appeared slightly larger, likely housing more than one servant. 2 narrow beds sat against opposite walls, their blankets neatly folded at the edges. A small fireplace, no longer used, held traces of soot from fires long extinguished. I imagined quiet evenings here, the servants reading letters from loved ones, sharing whispered stories, or simply resting after a day of careful labor. The room held an intimacy that was missing from the grand spaces upstairs. Here, life was slower, more deliberate, and profoundly human. I could almost hear faint echoes of laughter, whispered instructions, and soft footsteps, memories preserved like gentle imprints on the floorboards, walls, and air itself. Moving further down the hallway, I discovered a tiny kitchenette tucked into a corner. The counters were low, simple, and worn smooth from years of use. Old copper pots and pans hung from hooks above, their surfaces dulled but still sturdy. I imagined the servants preparing meals for the family upstairs, chopping vegetables, stirring soups, and quietly humming along with the rhythm of the household. The air must have smelled of roasted meat, fresh bread, and herbs, each aroma mingling in a calm symphony that only this wing of the mansion could hold. In the corner of the hallway, I found a small stack of letters tied together with a faded ribbon. These letters were messages between the servants themselves, written in careful handwriting. Some were brief notes to coordinate tasks, while others shared small personal stories or reflections on life in the mansion. One note read, "I enjoyed our walk through the garden today. The flowers bloom so quietly, yet they make the heart feel light." It was a simple sentiment, yet it spoke volumes about the gentle lives that unfolded here. Lives that were humble, unassuming, and deeply intertwined with the mansion's rhythm. I felt a sense of calm reading these words, a reminder that peace and meaning can be found in the smallest gestures and routines. I paused in front of a narrow staircase leading down to the basement, a place I had yet to explore. The basement seemed cooler still, with stone walls that carried the faint scent of earth and history. I imagined it had been used for storage, laundry, or perhaps even quiet workspaces. Every corner of the servants' quarters, every small nook and cranny, was a repository of ordinary life preserved patiently over centuries. Stepping carefully into the basement, I noticed faint echoes of long-ago footsteps moving softly through the hallways. There were no shadows attempting to frighten, no sudden noises, but just the gentle hum of history in stone and wood. I ran my hand along the cool wall, feeling the texture of the masonry, and imagined countless hands doing the same centuries ago, carrying out daily routines, solving small problems, and preserving a rhythm that the mansion itself had come to know. Back upstairs, I wandered to a small sitting room, likely a place where the servants gathered briefly before and after their shifts. A low table held a few teacups and a kettle, long unused but carefully stored. I imagined quiet conversations here, shared stories, or perhaps a fleeting moment of laughter before returning to duties. The room carried warmth, a sense of community and mutual care that the grand halls above could never entirely convey.
Even the smallest items, scratched tables, worn floorboards, faded curtains, seemed infused with memory. The mansion had held every movement, every whisper, and every quiet sigh. These were not dramatic, frightening, or urgent stories. They were the gentle, enduring tales of life moving slowly and meaningfully, preserved patiently in wood, stone, and air. I paused in the central hallway, taking a slow, deep breath. The servants' quarters were not glamorous, not dramatic, and certainly not frightening, and yet they were profoundly alive with the quiet energy of lives well lived, patiently observed, and gently preserved. With that thought, I moved toward the staircase leading back upstairs, feeling a sense of connection to the people who had lived, worked, and breathed in these rooms. The mansion had shared another layer of its story, one that was humble, patient, and deeply calming. And as I prepared to continue exploring, perhaps a hidden staircase or the master bedroom above, I carried the gentle rhythm of the servants' quarters with me, step by step.
From the quiet rhythm of the servants' quarters, I wandered slowly back toward the main wing of the mansion, my footsteps soft and deliberate. That's when I noticed it, a narrow seam in the wall, almost imperceptible, partially hidden behind a tall bookcase in the hallway. It was the kind of subtle detail that only someone paying very close attention would notice, a gentle nudge from the mansion itself, inviting exploration. Curiosity led me closer. I ran my fingers along the edge of the wall, and, with a soft push, the bookcase creaked slightly and swung aside, revealing a narrow staircase tucked away like a secret treasure. The wood was worn smooth from centuries of careful use, and faint scratches hinted at countless steps ascending and descending over the years. The hidden staircase was small, cozy, and oddly comforting, not ominous or threatening in any way. I descended slowly, feeling the gentle incline beneath my feet. The air grew cooler and carried the faint scent of aged stone and wood polish. A soft hush filled the space, as if the staircase itself had been waiting, patiently holding the stories of those who had used it long ago. I imagined children sneaking down to fetch a late-night snack, servants moving quietly between floors, or the occasional visitor discovering the secret passage for the first time. The staircase preserved these small adventures like delicate whispers tucked away from the grandeur above. The steps were uneven in places, worn more heavily in some spots than others. I ran my hand along the smooth banister, noting the subtle grooves left by centuries of hands, some large, some small, all part of the mansion's enduring memory. Each step carried me deeper into the quiet history of Ash Grove Mansion, and I felt a curious sense of connection with everyone who had walked here before. Halfway down, a small landing offered a peek into a hidden corner of the house, a storage room filled with old trunks and crates and carefully stacked linens. The moonlight filtering through a tiny window painted the room in soft, silvery hues. I could almost imagine the servants carrying baskets of laundry here, placing heavy cloths on the tables and pausing for a brief moment to rest. Every object, every crease in a fabric seemed infused with patient attention and ordinary care. I continued downward, the narrow staircase twisting slightly as it led to a lower floor I had not explored before. Here, the walls were closer together and the ceilings slightly lower, giving the space a cozy, intimate feel. There was a quiet hum to the air, an almost imperceptible echo of the past, like the faint whisper of footsteps that had traveled these steps for centuries. The mansion preserved these echoes with care, gentle reminders of life that moved slowly, patiently, and meaningfully.
Reaching the bottom, I found myself in a small, hidden chamber. Its walls were lined with shelves, much like a miniature library. Old journals, letters, and documents had been stored here, tucked away from sight. I carefully opened a leather-bound book and found delicate notes describing the mansion's secret uses, times when visitors had discovered the staircase, the occasional thrill of sneaking unseen, and the quiet joy of finding a hidden space in such a patient, enduring house. One note read, "The staircase is patient. It waits for those who are willing to notice, who move slowly and breathe deeply. It carries all footsteps with care, preserving them for the future." I smiled softly. That was exactly what I felt. Noticed, embraced, and guided gently by the mansion itself. The hidden staircase was not meant to frighten, startle, or intimidate. It was a subtle layer of history, a secret rhythm of life carefully preserved over centuries. I explored the chamber briefly, running my hands over the old wooden shells and the leather spines of journals. Each one held the whispers of people who had discovered the staircase, climbed it with curiosity, or used it to move quietly between floors. Nothing dramatic, nothing dangerous, simply the rhythm of ordinary life, patiently observed and lovingly preserved. The hidden staircase, I realized, was a metaphor for the mansion itself. It held secrets, yes, but not frightening ones. It rewarded patience, attention, and curiosity. Those who rushed through would miss it entirely. Those who moved slowly, like me, would find it quietly waiting, offering a connection to the lives of people long gone and the rhythm of a house that had observed everything without judgment. I began ascending slowly, retracing my steps back toward the main floors. Each step carried me upward, and I imagined centuries of hands gripping the same banister, centuries of feet moving along these worn stairs. The mansion had recorded them all, not as dramatic tales, but as subtle, enduring imprints, moments of curiosity, care, and gentle discovery. At the top, the bookcase swung back into place with a soft push, hiding the staircase once more. The hallway resumed its calm, ordinary appearance, yet I knew it had a secret within, a quiet, patient history that only revealed itself to those willing to notice. I ran my fingers along the wall where the seam had been, smiling at the mansion's playful patience. I stepped back into the main corridor, carrying the gentle presence of the hidden staircase with me. It reminded me that Ash Grove Mansion was a layered home, full of quiet stories waiting to be discovered. Every creak, every shadow, every small detail was a whisper of history, patiently preserved for anyone who moved slowly, observed carefully, and breathed gently. From here, I knew my next destination awaited, the old master bedroom, a space that promised intimacy, history, and memories preserved in fabric, wood, and faint scents. But I paused for a moment, letting the calm rhythm of the hidden staircase settle in my mind. The mansion had shared another quiet secret, another layer of life patiently observed, and I felt deeply connected to it all. With that thought, I walked toward the main stairwell, ready to explore the master bedroom above. The mansion's secrets were many, and I had learned that moving slowly, breathing deeply, and noticing patiently revealed stories that were far richer and more calming than any sudden scare could ever provide.
From the quiet corridors and secret staircases, I finally made my way to the old master bedroom, a space that felt like the heart of the mansion itself. Even before I entered, I could sense the weight of centuries pressing softly against the walls, not in a threatening way, but like the gentle hush of memories long held. The door loomed tall and sturdy, its brass handle worn smooth from generations of hands, each leaving a tiny trace of presence. I pushed it open slowly, and the room greeted me in soft, muted tones. Moonlight spilled across the floor, brushing over a canopy bed draped with faded curtains. The bed itself was grand, yet comforting, with linens that had lost their crispness but not their dignity. Dust motes floated lazily in the silver light, moving like tiny dancers in a silent and patient performance. The walls were adorned with portraits of the Ashgrove family, their faces painted in careful detail. At first glance, they appeared formal, as was customary in their era. But in the soft moonlight, the expression softened. The eyes seemed to watch not with judgment, but with gentle acknowledgement, as though they recognized me as another visitor curious enough to explore their quiet world. I moved slowly across the room, my footsteps absorbed by the thick, faded rugs. The scent was a combination of aged wood, faint lavender, and something subtly sweet, like pressed flowers hidden in a drawer. It was calming, almost as if the room itself had been designed to soothe anyone who entered, to cradle them in history and quiet reflection. On a small dressing table, a few objects were carefully arranged: a silver hand mirror, a porcelain brush, and a delicate perfume bottle that had long since lost its original scent. I imagined the mistress of the house moving through the room centuries ago, brushing her hair in the morning light, pausing to admire the soft fabrics, or perhaps glancing out the window to observe the gardens. The details were ordinary, but each one carried the weight of time, preserved with patience and quiet reverence. The canopy bed drew my attention most. Its curtains were drawn back slightly, revealing faint impressions where bodies had once rested. I imagined long nights spent in calm sleep, gentle dreams drifting through the mansion's walls, and the soft rhythm of human life preserved in linen and wood. It was intimate, comforting, and profoundly quiet, a place where the past could rest without disturbance. A faint draft drifted through a slightly open window, brushing the curtains softly. The air carried the scent of the garden below, mingling with the interior aromas to create a calm, layered presence. I paused, listening to the soft rustle of fabric and leaves, and felt a sense of connection to those who had once stood or rested in this very room. Life here had been ordinary in its details, yet extraordinary in its preservation. On a small nightstand beside the bed lay a folded letter. I picked it up carefully, feeling the texture of the aged paper beneath my fingers. The handwriting was delicate and flowing, a personal note from one of the Ashgrove family members. It read, "Even in the quietest moments, the house listens. It remembers, and so I find comfort in its calm presence, knowing that my days, though fleeting, leave gentle traces." I smiled softly. That was precisely what I felt in the master bedroom. The calm, gentle presence of the mansion itself, patiently holding every memory, every small gesture, every quiet sigh. Nothing was hurried, nothing was dramatic. Everything was observed and preserved in a slow, deliberate rhythm. The room held more than furniture and portraits. A small wardrobe stood against one wall, its door slightly ajar. Inside, the remnants of clothing hung carefully, faded but orderly. I imagined a gentle morning routine centuries ago, garments selected with care, hung neatly after wear, and stored patiently to be used again. Every small detail, even this, was part of the mansion's quiet storytelling. Moving toward the fireplace, I noted the cool stone surround, darkened by soot from fires long extinguished. I imagined evenings spent here, warm and calm, perhaps with a book or a quiet conversation. Even the soft echoes of laughter or the subtle creak of floorboards above seemed preserved in the walls, waiting for someone patient enough to notice. The master bedroom also held small personal artifacts, a delicate handkerchief embroidered with tiny flowers, a silver comb, and a journal tucked beneath the pillow. Each object spoke softly of life lived in quiet moments, preparations for social gatherings, private thoughts penned in solitude, and the simple joys of ordinary days. None of it was dramatic or startling. It was serene, human, and enduring. I paused near the window, gazing out at the garden bathed in moonlight. The flowers swayed gently in the night breeze, their fragrance drifting up and mixing with the warm scent of the room. I imagined family members once looking out at this view, taking in the soft curves of paths, the glow of lanterns, or the quiet rustle of leaves. Even the smallest details, the placement of a flower, the tilt of a window, the fold of a curtain, carried significance, preserved across centuries by the patient walls of the mansion. Sitting on the edge of the bed, I felt the calm settle over me like a gentle blanket. The master bedroom was a space of intimacy and reflection, where every object and shadow held a memory. It reminded me that the mansion's story was not only in its grand halls or hidden staircases, but in the quiet, human moments that occurred behind closed doors. I imagined the house itself as a gentle observer, quietly holding all these details, never judging, never rushing, simply remembering. The master bedroom was perhaps its most personal space, where the mansion's patience and memory were most profound. Every creak, every whisper of air, every glimmer of moonlight was part of a slow, deliberate narrative meant to soothe and comfort. Rising slowly, I took a final look around the room. The canopy bed, the portraits, the small artifacts, all spoke of lives quietly lived, gently preserved, and patiently observed. I felt a deep sense of connection to the people who had once occupied this space and to the mansion itself, which had held their memories with unwavering calm. With a final, gentle breath, I turned toward the door. The master bedroom had shared its quiet presence, adding another layer to my understanding of the mansion. Each room, each corridor, each secret staircase contributed to a rhythm of calm, reflective life, perfect for anyone seeking a peaceful exploration of history, memory, and gentle storytelling. And as I stepped back into the hallway, ready to discover the quiet presence lingering in other parts of the house, I carried with me the serenity of the master bedroom, the patient whispers of centuries, and the soft heartbeat of Ash Grove Mansion itself.
After leaving the master bedroom, I paused in the hallway, feeling a gentle shift in the mansion's atmosphere. There was a presence here, subtle, unassuming, yet deeply comforting. Not the kind of presence that makes your heart race or your skin prickle, but one that wraps around you like a soft blanket, warm, patient, and quietly observant. It was the mansion itself, breathing slowly, holding its centuries of stories and stillness. As I walked through the corridors, I realized the house remembers, not in a loud or intrusive way, but softly, patiently. Every creak of the floorboards, every faint echo in the distance, every whisper of wind through a cracked window felt purposeful.
as if the mansion were gently nodding to me, acknowledging my presence and inviting me to notice its calm rhythm. The portraits along the walls seemed to lean in slightly, their eyes following me without expectation or judgment. I imagined them speaking quietly to each other, perhaps noting my careful steps or admiring my patience in noticing details that most visitors would overlook. There was a playfulness here, too, not in the sense of trickery, but in the subtle way the mansion nudged you to look closer, breathe slower, and listen more attentively. I wandered into the long, shadowed hallway that connected the main rooms to the east wing. The soft moonlight streaming through tall windows highlighted faint dust motes swirling lazily in the air. They were tiny dancers, moving to a rhythm only the mansion could hear. It was mesmerizing, hypnotic even, and it made me feel that the house itself was alive, not in a threatening way, but in a gentle, patient, and comforting presence. Every room I passed seemed to contribute to this quiet awareness. The guest rooms held their ordinary stories of visitors long gone. The library preserved whispers of thoughts and observations. The servants' quarters carried echoes of care and routine. Even the hidden staircase had shared its secret rhythm. And now, as I walked these halls, I could sense it all together. The mansion's memory, patient and omnipresent, embracing every inch of space. I stopped at a window overlooking the garden. The moonlight touched the flowers, casting silver shadows across the paths. I imagined footsteps centuries ago, careful and deliberate, wandering these same grounds. The mansion remembered each step, each pause, each glance. There was no judgment, no hurry, just preservation. The garden and the house were partners in quiet storytelling, chronicling the calm lives of those who had moved through them. In one of the smaller sitting rooms, I noticed a delicate vase, chipped but intact, holding remnants of dried flowers. The fragrance was faint, almost imperceptible, yet somehow comforting. I imagined someone arranging the flowers centuries ago, pausing to appreciate their gentle beauty, and leaving them to be preserved by the house. That simple act, like countless others, became part of the mansion's quiet consciousness. As I moved deeper into the east wing, I became aware of a gentle feeling of being watched, not in fear, but in acknowledgement. The mansion was aware of me as I was aware of it. Each room, each object, each shadow seemed to breathe softly, resonating with centuries of calm attention. I felt as though I had entered a living memory, where every step I took was honored, preserved, and held gently in the house's patient embrace. Even the smallest details contributed to this presence. A scratch in the floorboard, a faded curtain, a forgotten trinket on a shelf. Everything had a story. And though these stories were quiet, ordinary, and unassuming, they combined to form a tapestry of history, patience, and gentle observation. The mansion did not need grand gestures to impress. It communicated through subtlety, rhythm, and persistence. I paused near the grand staircase, resting my hand on the polished wood of the banister. The faint warmth beneath my fingers seemed to pulse with centuries of use, hands that had gripped this railing, steps that had ascended and descended carefully, whispers of voices long gone. The mansion preserved them all, not as tales of drama, but as quiet, enduring reminders of life patiently lived. I wandered into a small chamber I had overlooked before, its walls lined with faded tapestries. The patterns were intricate, but softened with age, each thread carrying a memory of touch, a moment of craftsmanship preserved across time. I imagined artisans working patiently, dedicating hours to create something lasting, only to have it gently watched and appreciated by the mansion itself. The room felt alive with presence, not threatening, not airy, but calm, serene, and quietly powerful. The soft creak of the floorboards under my feet seemed amplified in this room, each sound carrying an echo of the past. The mansion remembered every footstep, every pause, every movement, and wrapped them in its quiet, enduring presence. I realized that the house's true spirit was not in what it looked like or what it contained, but in the patient preservation of every ordinary act, every gentle moment,
every whisper of human life. I moved toward the window at the far end of the chamber and looked out. The garden below shimmered softly in the moonlight, the shadows dancing slowly in the breeze. I imagined a traveler pausing here centuries ago, noticing the same quiet beauty and feeling the house's gentle awareness. The mansion did not demand attention. It simply offered itself, patiently waiting for those willing to move slowly, breathe deeply, and notice its calm rhythm. I took a deep breath, allowing the presence of the mansion to fill me. It was not frightening. It was not dramatic. It was quiet, patient, and profoundly gentle, a keeper of ordinary lives, small joys, and subtle rhythms preserved for centuries. Every creak, every shadow, every faint scent was part of a narrative that moved slowly, deliberately, and beautifully. As I prepared to leave the East Wing, I felt the mansion's quiet presence linger around me, soft and patient, like a gentle sigh. It was a reminder that history is not only in grand events or dramatic tales, but in ordinary life patiently observed and lovingly preserved. The house remembered every act of care, every quiet moment, every whisper of human life, and it shared that presence freely with anyone willing to notice. With one final, slow glance, I stepped back into the hallway. The mansion had offered me a gift, a glimpse of its calm, patient, and enduring spirit. It was not a presence to fear, but to appreciate, to learn from, and to carry gently in one's mind. And as I moved toward the final chapter of my journey, the slow return of dawn and the house's peaceful silence, I knew that the mansion's quiet presence would remain with me, softly guiding each step and breath along the way.
After a night of quiet exploration, I found myself standing near the grand windows of the mansion, watching the first hint of dawn gently touch the horizon. The night had been long, calm, and full of whispers, soft, patient stories of lives lived centuries ago. But now, as the first light began to filter through the tall windows, a new rhythm took hold. Dawn had arrived, and the mansion, like a living organism, was preparing to rest once more. The soft, silvery shadows of midnight slowly gave way to pale streaks of pink and gold. The moonlight, which had painted every corner in gentle silver, faded gradually, replaced by the tender glow of morning. The house seemed to breathe with the light, exhaling the calm of the night and welcoming the warmth of the new day. I imagined the Ashgrove family centuries ago waking to this same gentle transformation, the quiet hush of dawn filling their rooms with calm anticipation of a new day. I walked slowly through the hallways one last time, letting the changing light reveal details I hadn't noticed before. Dust motes sparkled in golden rays, carpets and rugs glowed softly, and the portraits seemed to come alive in subtle warmth. Their eyes no longer merely observed, they appeared to smile, carrying centuries of patience, memory, and quiet acknowledgement. The mansion seemed to be nodding to me, offering a farewell of gentle understanding. The grand hall, which had been a place of soft echoes and lingering moonlight, now glimmered with morning hues. Chandeliers caught the light in slow, dancing reflections, the faint sparkle almost hypnotic. I imagined the family centuries ago descending these stairs, their footsteps deliberate but calm, their mornings unfolding in rhythm with the mansion's patient heartbeat. Everything here, every creak of wood, every worn corner, every polished surface, carried history, not as a dramatic tale, but as a soft, enduring presence. I lingered in the library for a few final moments. The journals, letters, and books seemed to hum softly in the gentle dawn, as though acknowledging the passage of time and my careful attention. I remembered the hidden notes, the small discoveries, and the centuries of ordinary life preserved within these walls. Each page, each letter binding, each carefully recorded observation contributed to the mansion's vast, calm memory.
The house, it seemed, treasured ordinary life just as much as extraordinary events, if not more. Walking past the servants' quarters, I imagined the quiet routines unfolding again in my mind. Gentle footsteps preparing for the day, the soft hum of chores beginning, quiet conversations exchanged in whispers. Even the smallest actions, the folding of linens, the careful placement of utensils, the preparation of meals, were treasured by the mansion, woven into its fabric with enduring patience. Every movement had left a subtle imprint, and Dawn now highlighted these imprints with warmth and quiet reverence. I returned to the grand staircase, pausing to take in the view of the east wing and its soft glow. The hidden staircase, the secret chambers, the master bedroom, all had shared their patient stories with me, layer by layer. Dawn seemed to make the house even more alive, not in a dramatic sense, but in the sense of revealing centuries of slow, careful memory, perfectly preserved for anyone willing to move slowly, breathe deeply, and notice. As I approached the main entrance, the first birds began to sing in the gardens outside. Their gentle, melodious notes added a new layer to the mansion's calm symphony. I imagined centuries of dawns just like this, the same songs of birds, the same first light, the same gentle hush as the house prepared for another day. Time felt fluid here, not hurried, not urgent, simply unfolding in patient, soothing rhythm. I paused at the threshold, taking a slow, deep breath. The mansion had shared its entire night with me. The whispers of corridors, the gentle presence of rooms, the patient rhythm of the hidden staircase, the soft intimacy of the master bedroom. Every inch of the house had been alive with memory, observation, and calm. And now, as the sun's first rays filtered through the glass, it was ready to fall silent again, resting in preparation for the next night. The garden outside glimmered softly. Dew sparkled on leaves, petals swayed gently in the morning breeze, and the faint rustle of the grass carried the soft promise of another day. I imagined the mansion holding all these details, as it had held so many moments before. Its quiet presence encompassed centuries of ordinary life. Each ray of sunlight, each whisper of wind, each tiny movement was absorbed, acknowledged, and preserved. Before leaving, I turned for one last look inside. The mansion, bathed in soft dawn light, seemed to exhale, releasing the night's calm and welcoming the new day. I felt a deep gratitude for the gentle stories it had shared with me, the ordinary moments elevated to something timeless by patience, memory, and quiet observation. The house had reminded me that history is not only in grand events or dramatic tales, but in ordinary life, observed slowly, lovingly, and without hurry. Stepping outside, I felt the cool morning air brush against my skin. The mansion stood quietly behind me, its windows reflecting the first rays of the sun. The creaking doors, the soft echoes, the whispered histories all remained within its walls, waiting patiently for the next curious soul to walk slowly, breathe deeply, and listen to its gentle stories. It was at rest now, yet fully alive in its calm, enduring way. As I walked down the tree-lined path that led away from Ashgrove Mansion, I glanced back one final time. The shadows had softened, the windows glimmered with sunlight, and the mansion seemed at peace. It had shared its stories gently, patiently, and completely. I carried them with me, soft memories of creaking floors, whispered corridors, hidden staircases, and the quiet presence that lingered in every room. The house had returned to silence, yet its calm heartbeat remained in the walls, in the gardens, in the faint scent of aged wood and stone. Dawn had arrived, the night had ended, and the Ashgrove Mansion rested once more, patiently awaiting the next curious soul to walk slowly, breathe deeply, and listen to its gentle stories. With a final deep breath, I left the grounds. The whispers stopped, the shadows faded, and the house returned to rest. And in that stillness, I understood fully. This was not a haunted house, in the frightening sense, but a house alive with centuries of quiet, ordinary, and profoundly beautiful life. The mansion had been patient, the night had been calm, and dawn had broken softly. And now, as I walked away, I knew that its presence, gentle, watchful, and timeless, would remain with me long after the path behind me disappeared into the morning light.